Hello and welcome to Talking Meds, a podcast from PrescQIPP, engaging conversations about medicines-related dilemmas. I'm your host, Jonathan Underhill, Medicine's Clinical Advisor here at PrescQIPP. Hello, my name's Jonathan Underhill. Welcome to the latest episode of Talking Meds. I'm joined today by Laura Kearney. Laura is a medicines advice pharmacist with a clinical background in hospital pharmacy, and she now is the clinical lead pharmacist for the team at the UK Drugs and Lactation Advisory Service, the UK DLAS service, which is an NHS service advising on the use of medicines in breastfeeding. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, the use of medicines in breastfeeding. Laura has a background where she previously worked at the BNF, where Laura did her MSc. She specialises in the use of medicines in breastfeeding, as you'd imagine, given that she heads up that service. And in 2022 was the first UK pharmacist to become a UNICEF UK Baby Friendly Initiative qualified advocate, which sounds very grand indeed. Last year, she also became the first consultant pharmacist specialising in lactation and medicines advice. As you can imagine, Laura has a passion for ensuring that all babies and families are supported to breastfeed and provide evidence-based, holistic care and advocate for change. Laura and I first came across each other, I think, when I was working for NICE, and we were part of an MHRA initiative looking at providing more consistent information about the use of medicines in pregnancy, but also in breastfeeding and lactation. And I became aware at that point about the inconsistencies that there are, I think, in the information that's out there for women, and also I think for healthcare professionals advising women about what to do about medicines and breastfeeding. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It gives us an opportunity for you listeners to perhaps upskill a little bit in your own personal knowledge about the use of medicines in breastfeeding, but also gives us an opportunity to have a good old chin wagging conversation about this. So Laura, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. In terms of your career, what was there anything that I missed there, or I guess it's more, what was it that made you want to work in this service?
Yeah, well, I think it was a bit more sort of by chance, really. So in 2008, I came to Leicester Hospitals, which is where the service is based, and it just so happened that the medicines advice service that I was working in was specialising in medicines use in breastfeeding. That was their speciality. I very sort of quickly realised how much of a special service this actually was and how much of a difference it was making. But I think it was actually my own breastfeeding journey that wasn't plain sailing. I had lots of issues, and it was actually with my second child, my daughter. And it wasn't because of medication use, but I was told to start feeding her with formula. And that choice being taken away, sort of probably incorrectly, is what made me sort of really passionate about making a difference, that whatever the reason, the barriers need to be explored. And I didn't want medication use to be a barrier for people who choose to breastfeed. So it's been a sort of mixture of coincidence, realization about such a specialist service, and also my own sort of journey, which has brought me to this point.
Yeah, that's not dissimilar to other stories that I hear on here. It often tends to be a little bit of serendipity, a little bit of luck, a little bit of saying yes to something and then something turns up. But then there's that personal experience that people have with it. And yes, that sort of thing sort of strikes home, doesn't it? It makes you think, you know what, I want to do something about this. I want to help other people who are in my position so that they don't feel, I don't know, unsure and vulnerable and maybe a little bit of regretful about the decisions that they've made because the information wasn't there for them. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
And I think even as a healthcare professional, even though I had a lot of knowledge, you are in a vulnerable position, and actually you're still trusting what your healthcare professional is telling you and advising you. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, I could empower people as much as possible so that they could be much more informed with their own choices.
Fantastic. So just in terms of I remember being taught about this when I was I think a pre-reg going through my medicines information rotation and contacting the service and Trent and reading up around the principles of safe medicines use in breastfeeding. So what are they then?
Yeah, so there's lots of like tools that you can sort of use to help you assess whether or not a medicine is sort of compatible with breastfeeding. And I must sort of say we do try and avoid using the word safe, and that's because obviously the evidence around using these medicines in breastfeeding is such poor quality, doesn't exist. So there's always going to be that kind of element of unknown. So what we try and do is say that this medicine is okay to use in breastfeeding. This medicine is compatible with breastfeeding, that sort of thing. So we just try and avoid using the word safe because I think it gives that level of assurance, which I just don't believe that we actually have in this area. You can obviously go into the pharmacokinetics, which is what we do, especially when we don't have evidence to help us support the decision that we're making. And you can look at things like protein binding. So if a medicine is highly protein bound, for example, then it's going to hug onto those proteins and there'll be less free drug available to pass across into the breast milk. So there's lots of principles that can help you decide whether it's going to be likely that that medicine is going to pass across into the milk. So there's that side of it. There's looking at the evidence. If you've got evidence to support your choice, that's really helpful. But as we kind of said, often is the case that you are just looking at a bunch of case reports. You're never going to get that randomized control trial. The best you're going to get is perhaps a cohort study that's looked at all of this. But the numbers are very, very small and the quality is not great either. But one thing we do try and sort of turn it on its head a little bit, and I think this has become a bit lost in when people are trying to make these risk assessments, is that there is obviously a risk in using a medicine in breastfeeding. There is always going to be some degree of risk, but it's how you manage that. And within that risk assessment, we need to ensure that we're also thinking about the benefits of breastfeeding. So breastfeeding is hugely beneficial for both the mum and the infant, and that's been shown in both short-term and long-term health benefits. And that is completely evidence-based. So what we're weighing up against is an evidence-based known benefits of the breastfeeding versus unknown, unquantifiable potential risks of medicine exposure. And I think as pharmacists, we're very good at focusing in on the not knowing about the medication risk and that sort of tipping the balance for us. And we're not very good at thinking about actually there's a huge amount of evidence showing the benefits of breast milk and actually what is going to be the consequence if I tell someone to stop breastfeeding because of this medication use. Is that really worth me telling them to stop? So what we are trying to teach people is actually your starting point should be, yes, I'm going to allow this medication use in breastfeeding. And actually what you're looking for is a really good rationale as to why that should not be the situation. And sometimes you are going to come up with that rationale, but very often is the case that you're not, because actually the evidence you're using to say that this isn't a good idea is such poor quality still. So it's really about sort of changing that thinking and really pulling in that, the evidence we have about how beneficial breast milk exposure is.
That's fascinating. So that almost turns it on its head for me because
Yeah.
I would think that a lot of people would be well. There was an article, wasn't in the Pharmaceutical Journal a few months ago, talking about how scared actually people are about the use of medicines in breastfeeding. Not just the parents, the mums themselves, but the healthcare professionals are as well. So there is that almost that conservatism to that approach for the use of medicines in breastfeeding. Whereas I think what you're saying and your service is saying is actually the onus is on there needs to be a good reason for not using it in breastfeeding. But I guess there's also those principles there about, first of all, about the use of the medicine in the first place. So does the mum really, really need this medicine? Because
Yeah,
obviously, if you're not using your medicine, then it's obviously not going to be expressed in the breast milk. So, and that's obviously going to be a principle there as well. And then, as you say, it has the first port of call needs to be breast, that sort of breast is best sort of approach where if you can breastfeed, then that's what you should do, because that's the thing that's most nutritious for the child. But yeah, so it is quite interesting that for me, Laura. I don't know if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just thinking about how exposure to breast milk for the infant and the act of breastfeeding for the mother is actually a huge public health intervention, and we don't value it enough at all. And breastfeeding in the UK is actually really, really tough. People might be aware of the statistics and things, but we're very good at initiating breastfeeding. Around 80% of women who give birth are breastfeeding in those sort of initial days and weeks. But then by about 6 to 8 weeks, we've gone down to 50%. And then the WHO recommendation is that you breastfeed at least for 6 months, exclusively on breast milk. But our rates in the UK are at around 1% at that time point. So although the intention is there, we're very, very quickly, there's huge challenges and barriers in our culture which are preventing us from breastfeeding as long as we want to. And 8 out of 10 women finish their breastfeeding journeys before they actually wanted to as well. So it's all about trying not to make medication use a barrier in this whole sort of complex scenario we're in the challenges we're facing. But as you say, the first step to that is kind of using our medicines optimization principles as well, because obviously a much safer approach to this is the less you're exposed to, the less risky the scenario is. So, and sometimes it's a case of actually you might be giving them a position at this time point because they're on a whole load of medicines because they're in an acute situation, but actually a week or 2 weeks down the line, that situation might have changed. So it's about being a little bit fluid with the clinical scenario as well, that you can sort of advise further down the line as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the example that I saw in that article in the pharmaceutical journal was a mum who had inflammatory bowel disease, was on adalimumab, was controlled on the adalimumab. Her symptoms were controlled on the adalimumab, but was advised to stop because she was breastfeeding. Adalimumab is not bioavailable orally, so it doesn't go into your breast milk. So there's that position of ignorance that had misinformed that mum, caused probably an untold amount of stress in that through lack of ignorance. So I guess my next question is, what are the trusted sources for people to go to for help and advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to touch on that. And I suppose just taking a sort of step back and acknowledging that it is really tricky advising in this area, because a lot of the sources which are out there will tell you that it's not a good idea for whatever reason. It might be the SPCs telling you that because it's basically a sort of legal document rather than a clinical document. You might be sort of looking in the BNF, which can be oftentimes very overly cautious in terms of breastfeeding. They are trying to change that standpoint now and doing lots of work around that. But it's not surprising that people very often come across information which is telling them that this isn't a good idea. So it is about that awareness of, well, what are the good sources then to look at? Obviously, I'm going to say that the information that we publish is a great resource. So we've got over 50 articles published on the SPS website, covering lots of kind of frequently asked scenarios. So antipsychotics, antidepressants, antihypertensives, things like that. We also write the information on the NHS website as well. So on those medicines A to Z monographs, the breastfeeding information is written by us. And that's like a really useful tool to use when you're trying to have this discussion with the patients as well. In terms of other free resources, and presumably these can be put in the show notes, hopefully, but
Absolutely.
there's LactMed, which is an amazing resource. It's produced by it's an American website, but it's part of their government suite of products that they provide for all sorts of health related issues. And that is the best place to find your evidence for that medicine in breastfeeding. And it also really helpfully tells you whether or not the medicine itself affects the lactation process. So it's really up to date as well. So that's a fantastic resource. And then the other one that I'll point out as well is eLactancia, which is a Spanish website, but it's translated into English. But it's quite succinct and it gives you a kind of traffic light status as well and goes into all those pharmacokinetics. So if you do want to dive into the pharmacokinetics, that's a really quick way of finding those out. And I'll just mention quickly also the Breastfeeding Network. So they provide some like really good practical advice on using medicines in various scenarios, which is sort of aimed to sort of help both patients and healthcare professionals as well. So there's loads of stuff out there. It's just about awareness and knowing where to find it. But we can hopefully put those links in the show notes after this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Laura. I mean, but on that sort of that evidence generation side of things, it's not um, it's not it's not hard to understand why there isn't large randomized controlled trials. Getting the ethical approval to do a randomized controlled trial of women who are breastfeeding will be very, very difficult. Therefore, if there's no evidence, the manufacturers in their legal document, the summary of product characteristics, are going to be conservative. They're going to say, sorry, we haven't got any information to support this, which is why you need people like yourselves providing a service that says, actually, yes, we don't have any randomized controlled trial evidence, but we do have some practice here. We have some case reports. We have perhaps some observational studies where we've looked back retrospectively and looked on that can still provide you with good, reassuring evidence of safety over and above the pharmacokinetic profile of the medicine as well. And that's what I found when I've looked in these sites. It gives you a really good, constructive argument, science-based, as to what the pros and cons are of using a medicine and breastfeeding. And as I say, I've always found it really useful in terms of increasing my own awareness and information when I'm advising others about what to do. And I'd certainly recommend people access the service. Just in terms of so I mentioned the adalimumab example. I mean, you must come across quite a few common examples from your practice, the sort of things that you get asked about on a regular basis. What sort of things are we talking about here?
Well, I suppose our service, because of the nature of it, is we'll take calls from any healthcare professional around the UK, regardless of whether we've published information on it or not. So sometimes we get quite straightforward stuff, but we do specialise in sort of highly complex situations. So it will be things like an infant who's been born prematurely, and because of that reason, the mother is often obviously acutely unwell, and they will be on a whole concoction of medicines, and that might include like some past sort of history that she also has. So she may well be on antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, things like that, and it's that kind of chronic illness plus the acute reason she's sort of given birth, and looking at whether or not those medicines are okay to expose that premature infant to. So yeah, we get quite a lot of premature infant cases. At the moment, one of the hot topics is the GLP-1s. Lots of people are asking whether or not they are okay in breastfeeding, and the cohort is kind of changing as well. So women who are older are obviously having children later, and so they're breastfeeding later. So there's things like IVF, because they're like trying for their next baby. Also women who are on HRT now and breastfeeding still. And there's also things like ADHD, which is another sort of huge sort of uptick we've had in terms of inquiry use, because obviously we're getting adults who are being now diagnosed later in life, and also children who were diagnosed younger are now also coming up to childbearing age. So we're seeing a lot of sort of people who've got medications for ADHD and whether or not they're okay in breastfeeding. But we get asked all sorts of stuff, and we also get asked some like really weird and crazy things as well. So for example, there was a time when there was a person who had they were actually a vet, and they were looking after a dog, but they accidentally sort of pricked themselves with the injection that they were going to give to the dog. But this was a breastfeeding person as well. So obviously we had to sort of advise them whether or not this was going to be a risk to them sort of breastfeeding. So yeah, we do get a lot of sort of issues that sort of appear just because by accident something's happened, and they need advice on how to proceed here on in. So yeah, we do get asked a range of things.
Yeah, yeah. We always like stories about people's pets or animal encounters. So that's a very memorable one, I suspect, for you,
Yeah.
Laura. I mean, we've talked about how difficult it is to generate evidence in this area. Do you see anything in the future where we're using sort of, I don't know, large language models, AI, real world evidence to try and help give us more stronger evidence on the use of medicines in breastfeeding?
Yeah, so I think as we've said, like generating the evidence is hugely challenging in this area because there are so many ethical implications, and the study, if they're going to conduct a study, it has to ensure that it doesn't interfere with the intention to breastfeed. There would need to be parental consent in terms of exposing that infant to that medication. It's unethical to blind to someone to say, you'll be in the non-breastfeeding arm. It's obviously unethical to do that. Um, so yeah, the evidence generation is hugely challenging in this area, but I think as we're seeing in other areas, these sort of population pharmacokinetic modeling that we're beginning to see, and that's certainly happening in pediatrics, renal areas like that. We are now beginning to see that in the breastfeeding literature as well. So, um, sort of very simply, and I'm definitely not an expert on population pharmacokinetic modeling, but basically they take a sample of real life situations. So using various patient characteristics, doses, methods of administration. And the variation in that is good because it generates like a nice varied set of real life data. And then they produce a kind of model based on that data, which is a very complex way of doing things. But that model allows them then to plug in different parameters into that model. So you could add in this patient's got renal failure, or this patient is pregnant, or this patient is breastfeeding. And then they test that against the real life data that they had. And then once that's been tested, the model can kind of be used to sort of predict what's going to happen in those scenarios. So that is definitely what we are beginning to see in the breastfeeding literature. And I think it's important that we have an awareness of what this means, and its limitations, but also where it's adding value as well. And it's certainly a way that the regulators are now beginning to rely on this data, certainly for pediatric studies. And in the UK, this is being looked at in terms of, can they rely on this for sort of pregnancy and breastfeeding information? It's already happened with the FDA. So I think this is definitely something we are going to see a lot more of. So we're no longer going to be relying completely on that traditional case study, real life evidence. It will be this sort of mathematical modeled evidence that we're beginning to see.
Fantastic. I mean, it's one of those. I mean, AI scares me as it does for most people, but I think one of the things it can really help with is that sort of really generation of taking complex sort of adverse data together and compiling it and doing thematic analysis of that the brain can never do, or human will take humans weeks and months and years to do. It can do very, very quickly. So I think the potential there is huge. So look forward to seeing what happens on in that regard. Um, that's been fantastic, Laura. Just to finish off, we always like to do, what three things would you say to people to do, if nothing else? And I mean, there's certainly something about having a look at those resources, I think, isn't there? As the first one. But I mean, is there anything else that you think of the three things that people might think about doing differently as a result of this?
Yeah, I mean, definitely go and have a look at the resources, empower yourself, get familiar with the resources. They're great. They are going to sort of help you make much better decisions around medicine use in breastfeeding. So I'm going to steal that maybe as my one, unless I start thinking of more things as I start talking. My number two is going to be always start with a yes. always start with a yes, and you might end up with it being a no, but I think if you change that mindset, you're going to definitely take on board those evidence-based benefits of breastfeeding, and we really, really need to include that in our risk assessments. And the other sort of thing that I would say, my third thing, would be if you do come across a resource which is saying no, and that might be the SPC or wherever, it might be somewhere else that you're using, always double check that. Double check that somewhere else, because just because one place says a no, you don't know how they've sort of come across that. That might just be a legal stance, it might be an overly cautious stance. So always go and check somewhere else in one of those other resources. And if you're not sure as well, run it past a colleague, talk it through a colleague and see what you're coming through. And obviously people can always contact our service for support and advice as well.
Brilliant. I love that. I love that. Start with a yes. It reminds me a little bit of the Carol Dweck growth mindset stuff, where if you've got a growth mindset and you start with a positive, you're much more likely to enable yourself to grow. But also, I think just in terms of that caution as well, it's that start with a yes, but then make sure that you check and double check and you've used the best sources possible. So no, I really like that. The one thing for me out of this, I think, is that it would be great to get you to do a clinical masterclass for PrescQIPP on the use of medicines in breastfeeding, because I do think it's an area that's potentially been, I won't say undervalued, but underplayed a little bit.
Yeah.
And that has resulted in people being overly cautious, I think. And there's a lot that I think we could that you can help fix, just in terms of the awareness raising of that. So leave that with us, and we'll see what we can do by getting you to do a clinical masterclass, I think. But thank you so much for your time, Laura. That's been absolutely brilliant. Thanks.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
See you next time, guys. Bye. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next episode of Talking Meds from PrescQIPP, engaging conversations about medicines-related dilemmas. Please follow us on LinkedIn and Blue Sky to join in with the discussions, and email us on talkingmeds@prescript.info with your feedback or suggestions for future topics or guests. Please don't forget to register for access to the PrescQIPP website for all of our excellent resources.